Hi everyone, we're here another week at Mutant Woods, and I'm really like personally excited about this, so like emotional if you say so. And we today have here two very special guests, Ann Nocenti, who wrote the issues that we're going to talk about today, aside from a lot of other stuff and editing, a lot of X-Men stuff. You can all watch or so with talking about the other stuff if you want. But today we're going to focus on Jessie Drake that appears in the issues Marvel Comics Presents 150 and 151. Yeah, I got the numbers right. And and in those issues, the character of Jessie Drake is introduced, and we're gonna talk a lot about Jessie today. So that's gonna be the main topic, and that's why we brought up DANI KINNEY, who is a writer at Women Writes About Comics and also a consultant, sensitivity reader, and doing like all this stuff for like trans issues and intersex issues in comics. And so those are the two people that I'm gonna have here today, and we also have Travis and me, the usuals from Mutant Woods, and we're really excited, as is all the people in the comments already. So
Oh,
yeah, that's really sweet, like a lot of people.
wow.
So let's go.
This week on Mutant Watch.
Wow.
So I'm gonna let the beginning of the show go to Danny, because because you want to kind of do a recap of what the issue is about, what it talks about, and kind of get the baseline so everybody that is watching is like following the story. I recommended people to read it before, but if you haven't read it, we're gonna do a little breakdown, and then we start with the questions of the specific things that we're going in this issue. That does a little bit of like a lot of them with a lot of different topics, and yeah. So if you want, Danny.
Sure, yeah. So to save everyone the time of me granularly explaining page by page, I'll kind of just zone in on Jessie. So the Jessie story kind of is, framed within, I think, the larger context of an ongoing story about Mary Walker, also known as Typhoid Mary, also known later in the story as Bloody Mary. Jessie Drake is introduced to us when she is brought to a facility called the Fortress, which is a kind of superhuman military research facility, as I understand it. And she is, you see these very like interesting kind of like oblique references to a group that's, I think, later revealed to be the Eugenics. This kind of team of young superhumans that are being brought up in this facility to believe that they are living in a far future civilization sometime after what's referred to as the Horizon Wars. So this is the kind of like the structure that we first encounter Jessie in, and she's being held here. It's, established that Wolverine sent by Charles Xavier to find this mutant because he I think he refers to her as having an impressive psionic presence, I think is the term, or something close. I might be paraphrasing. But so Jessie and Wolverine, or Mary and Wolverine, go to the facility. Mary's eventually captured. Mary eventually breaks out as Bloody Mary. And then, Jessie and Mary escape. They make their way out to a housing shelter. It's there that we learn that Jessie, the reader and Mary, learns that Jessie is trans when a member of the shelter staff essentially gender polices Jessie's body, pointing it out to Mary. Mary is, for lack of a better term, shocked. There is a really intense scene where, Mary kind of discusses feeling betrayed, misgendering Jessie, and the scene ultimately culminates with Mary, physically assaulting Jessie, and for lack of a better term, kind of abandoning Jessie in the shelter. There is a really fascinating plot that kind of evolves from there, of Mary kind of taking a file from the shelter and sort of just tracking down like known abusive men in Hell's Kitchen, and like really just beating the ever-loving snot out of these guys. All the while, Vengeance, Wolverine, Daredevil, and Steel Raven are kind of having this like this fight in the background, more or less, from what I understand, trying to determine like who it is that's actually going to be the intervening force in Mary's story. But ultimately, Jessie returns towards the end of 151, and that's when she and Mary have the opportunity to kind of like sort of reconcile, to kind of, we see Jessie hold space for herself and kind of describe her own experience of her gender. We see the process of Mary trying to kind of wrap her head around not only Jessie's identity, but to try to better understand her own. And, through Jessie's abilities, which as a mutant, her ability is, I think, described as an empathic metamorph, she's able to kind of not consolidate Mary's identities, but I think from what I read that scene, it kind of feels like Mary is brought somewhat closer to kind of like a gestalt sense of those identities, is not consolidating them, but is kind of accounting for them and holding space for them in a way that she wasn't able to. She's able to do that through Jessie and through her abilities. And, ultimately they revisit the facility that Mary was being held at. They confront some of the staff there who, for lack of a better term, were quite literally like chronically assaulting and abusing Mary. And then from there, Mary and Jessie quite literally like walk off into the sunset, and we don't see Jessie again from that point on until this coming Wednesday, the Pride anthology.
Yeah.
That's a very oversimplification of 2 issues of comics that, like, I think statistically is probably the comics story that I've read the most. There are also 2 issues of comics that I own like at least 10 copies of each at this point. Every time I see one, I'll pick one up just in case. So I think I might own the largest collection of Jessie Drake comics in the world at this point.
For now.
For now.
Until this Wednesday.
Yes. But yeah, I highly recommend everyone reading these 2 issues and reading Ann's run that kind of surrounds it, because they're fascinating. They're incredibly nuanced, and like, yep, there it is. And there are issues of comics that like I continue to return to, which anyone who knows my work knows I just don't shut up about Jessie Drake at this point. So, the issues are far more amazing than my recap was, and you should go out and read them. You should go out and buy them. They are on Marvel Unlimited, I believe. So, yeah.
So, from this point, and for starting somewhere with this talk about Jessie, I think we can go from different points that the issues like bring up her identity in different ways, even though some of the best ones are near the end. So we're starting with some of the more complicated ones at the beginning. And so the first time that is brought up, as Dani said, is when it is revealed as she's trans. And the response from Mary in this moment is like heavily like rejecting and like yeah, it's like a transphobic aggression. And that moment replicates a lot of the themes that today people make when they make transphobic arguments. Replicates a lot of the things that people say about like us like tricking people into believing things, or like just like harming them in some way with our existence. So I wanna ask you both about that thing, both Ann and Dani. Whoever wants to talk about that first. Maybe Dani, you have something more to say of what I say.
So should I answer that question?
Go ahead.
First of all, I want to apologize if it was at all traumatic for anyone, but when I would write a Typhoid Mary story, she has 4 personalities. So you say, how would Mary react? How would Mary have reacted to meeting Jessie Drake? She would have been all love, all acceptance, all love. How would Typhoid have reacted? Typhoid would have tried to pick her up. I mean, Typhoid is all how she can use sex, manipulate sex. Mary Walker, who's the 4th character, would have been fairly indifferent because she's kind of the watcher and she just observes. Bloody Mary is on a mission. She's a man-hater. There's no word. There's no, and sometimes I guess we talk about semantics. There's no word for the reverse of a misogynist. She, for whatever reason, Bloody Mary is the avenger of all women, and she is whatever the opposite word for misogynist is. So for her, it wasn't so much about being tricked. I think that in the story, what happens in the story is that Bloody Mary gains ascendance over the all-love Mary and the all-sex Typhoid. And she is on a mission because she's just angry at men at that point. So I think that the moment that is a very flawed moment that we didn't think it through, Steve Lightle and I plotted the story together, and we didn't think it through as to how all we could see was Bloody Mary hates men and therefore is angry that Jessie Drake, she thinks Jessie Drake has tricked her. And that is the reaction that's from her point of view. Now, should Steve and I have thought, well, how's that going to be seen by people reading this? We didn't really think it through because it's a comic and you're doing a lot of them and you're doing them fast. And it's kind of, if I could go back 30 years ago and rewrite the moment with this wonderful essay in front of me, I would have rewritten the scene, absolutely. So so I think that's the complicated nature of who Typhoid Mary is. It was a kind of a reaction to how it felt at the time to be a female, and to be a female working in comics, and the way females were in comics at the time. And we didn't have this sort of more sophisticated thing we have now. We have the Bechdel test, and can you trade a female character out for a lampshade, and does it matter? And then it was, I think, Gail Simone's refrigerator. So you have all these women in comics that have since said, what were women in comics when it was mostly men writing them? They were secretaries. They were seen as the Madonna or the whore. They were seen as the good wife. They were seen as, so Typhoid was a reaction to how I felt being, what it was like to be gendered as a female in the 80s, and how the compartments you were put into. And Typhoid Mary was meant to be kind of a satirical look at all that by taking all the stereotypes, rolling them into one. And she's definitely she's satiric, but she's also she is a collection of stereotypes. She is kind of a collection of stereotypes and cliches. So in writing that story, we didn't think it through. That moment that you so beautifully articulate in your essay was kind of like a surprise to me. And also, it's funny, I hadn't read that comic since I wrote it. I think when you first called me, I had to go online and order a copy because I didn't have any copies. And then I read it and I went, oh my God, I see what she's talking about. So I think it's like a wonderful thing to examine these moments in comics. And the other thing that it says in the essay, I know you end your essay with Marvel Do Better. And I have to say that at the time, nobody hesitated in saying, sure, put a, I don't think the term transgender was used much back then, if at all. I think it was transvestite to transsexual to transgender. It was like cross-dressing. There were a whole different group of semantics that have obviously been reassessed and updated since the 90s. But I mean, the editor, what was the editor's name? Now I'm blanking on the editor's name. But there was like, nobody said you can't do this or you shouldn't do this. So I think that Marvel at the time was really open to writers doing whatever the hell they wanted to do. And so I would say that if me as an editor, because I worked I worked with Chris Claremont for years and did all the Mutant books. If Chris or any writer had walked into my office and said, I want to do a transgender character, I would have said, great. I would have asked, I think Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief. He would have said, great. There was no, but the thing is that you feel like an imposter when you write something that you are not. And so while in comics, I would always talk to, say, John Romita Jr., who I did Daredevil with, we would always say, New York City is full of diversity. Let's make sure that the streets are always filled with diversity. But that's another leap to say, I feel like I could write a transgender character, which I think that at the time back in Marvel in those days, you had a line of guys out the door trying to write comics, but you didn't have transgender, a person knocking on my door. I think they would have been very welcome and we would have done a story. So it was also really surprising to me to find out that this was the only transgender character. I mean, how did that happen? What happened? Why has this not happened yet? Because certainly it's time, but I don't mean to defend Marvel Comics, but I do think that probably somebody just has to approach them with authenticity, because nobody wants to have imposter syndrome. Nobody wants to write a character that you don't really feel in your bones. So I don't know if that explains much, but I'm trying.
No, that's great. I don't know if Danny wants to pick it up, or I pick it up.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think to kind of reverse, to back my way through what we're talking about, I think in terms of how we got to where we are with Jessie being the only trans character for such a long time, I think like Marvel today is the same Marvel that is still employing a man who impersonated a Japanese man to sell comics for a number of years. This is clearly like a Marvel who's embraced a kind of like neoliberalist approach to progressive storytelling. It is clear that we can just take the fact that like the amount of trans writers working for Marvel is fractional at best. The amount of trans writers on ongoing books is fractional at best. And so it kind of, to what you're getting to, Anne, it forces cis writers to...
as of next week. Two
Yes.
trans writers. As of next week, there's 2 ongoing books.
And what is this Wednesday anthology you're talking about? Is that a Marvel thing?
Oh,
Yeah.
Marvel Voices Prize. They're doing a prize anthology, and
Okay.
there's one Jessie story.
Oh, there
in the
is.
anthology.
Well, there's a Black Cat story that
A Black
involves
Cat
Jessie.
story that involves Jessie. We're not asking too much.
And who wrote the Black Cat story?
Leah Williams.
Oh, cool. So, and is it a good story? Have you read it?
I've read it, but I
Una
think
has
I
read it.
can't say anything yet because it's a review copy. So we're like with hands tied. But
We're under embargo at the moment.
we're under embargo. I can't say anything.
Oh.
Well, and I was just thinking, the only 2 examples around the same time, one much earlier and one just after Jessie that I can think of at Marvel. I know the writers, Connie, that was in the Elektra book in the 90s, and in the 80s, the Cloud thing. I know both writers said that they were allowed to do those stories, but there had to be a fantastic reason for the transness. And so Connie doesn't realize that she's trans until she's magically made into a woman. And then, this is what I've been looking for. This is why I've been confused. And Cloud is an actual nebula out in space who just happened to have male and female forms because a nebula got confused. And so both stories were okayed and they ran them. But I know that the writers have talked about that they had to justify, and that may just come down to individual editors or...
Who are the editors and writers of those stories?
The Cloud story was Peter Gillis, and I'd have to look up who the editor was. The writer on the Elektra was Peter Milligan.
Oh.
And so I would have to look up and see who the editors were on either of those books. But it may just come down to that. It may just come down to individual editors, or who knows.
Yeah, I mean, my instinct would be to say it would be to put imposter syndrome at the forefront. Is that you don't everybody's shy to write about something that they don't feel that they have the right to do so. So I think that that might be one of the problems, is that the doors need to open wider to different artists and writers, and there needs to be an editor that is in charge of diversity, that is welcoming those kinds of stories. And I just don't know. I mean, I haven't worked at Marvel since 1989, so although I'm friends with Marvel, I mean, I'm a Marvel girl, as they say, but and I know that I would assume that someone like Sana Amenet, or you could just approach her and say, this is a problem. And I really doubt that there would be any resistance to opening a door that way. I mean, I think it just has to happen. And I don't think you'd have much resistance. Maybe I'm being really naive. I would think that Marvel would welcome that, and I'm happy to mentor you if you want to try.
I mean, I think I'm gonna pick my words very delicately so that Marvel doesn't cut my power and send their team to get me. But I think having the information that I do have about kind of what's going on behind the scenes in the X office at the moment, there is like a felt sense of I'm trying to think like the best way to put this. I mean, there is not probably an explicit mandate to say don't write trans characters, but it is there is an editorial culture being embraced being imposed from the Marvel higher ups that is preventing anyone from telling these stories right now, because there are writers who are really pushing behind the scenes, having really intense conversations, trying to argue for these stories to be told.
Okay.
And Marvel is just, it's shutting them down. It's canceling the book that claimed to be putting a trans character in a feature story at some point. And so we're seeing a Marvel that is slowly shifting, I think largely due to the fact that, now everything needs to be sort of framed in terms of, can this reflect well on the latest MCU experience, the latest Marvel movie that we make, and, kind of sanitizing everything to ensure that, conservative fans of the movie who find the comics aren't put off by all these, wacky genders that we have running around. And like, I think I give credit to Leah for finding an opportunity to basically like shunt Jessie into another story in a way that, like, we're still fighting for scraps, but I would also like applaud any attempt to introduce these characters, and also holding space for Vita Ayala, who is trying to populate New Mutants with as many trans characters in the background as possible, so that at some point, maybe their story right now can't pick up on these threads, but they can circle back to them. They can leave these things as something that, these characters can be reached back to kind of pull them forward by other writers, if and when Marvel ever allows trans people to show up on the page in really visible ways. I mean, they get my letters, so to speak. Marvel's not, they know what I'm out here saying.
Well, I don't, I wasn't aware of that, obviously. And I think that, that is the problem with valuable IP. So when I was at Marvel for the entire 80s, there wasn't any valuable IP. And actually when, I forget, when was Jessie Drake, when were those stories written? What year?
Written 1988, published 1994.
Yes.
88? 88?
88?
They were published in 1994. I know because I was born that year.
Yeah, it'd be 94, right?
1994? Yeah. So 94 was when Marvel was going bankrupt. I mean, so I remember, to give you another context of the time. For one thing, that story was written before the IP was valuable, so people cared less about being on model and you could really stretch the characters quite a bit, and it was all just fun. And I think that I remember that Typhoid Mary was kind of a popular new character. And so there was pressure to do more stories with Typhoid Mary. So I remember that Marvel Comics Presents, the editor called me and wanted like some typhoid stories, but really fast. Because there was me, Steve Marianne, and Fred Harper. And we produced those stories like overnight. I mean, you have no idea how fast they were done. And Marvel was going bankrupt at the time, and they wanted a lot of guest stars. So that's why you have Wolverine and Ghost Rider, and I forget who else is in the issue. They wanted it loaded with superheroes because, everybody was trying to pump sales to keep the company from going under. And I wasn't that interested in Ghost Rider and Wolverine at the time for that story. I mean, to me, in a weird way, they were just sort of, they were just lampshades, they were just like men that, to show how powerful Typhoid was, that all these men were chasing after her, but they were unimportant to me. It was more exploring what it was like to be a female in the 80s. And then I think Marvel went bankrupt like a year later. Yeah, so it's those times were very different. The company went under. They filed Chapter 11, and there were a lot of behind the scenes shenanigans going on back then that aren't relevant to your podcast. But I knew a lot of stuff that was going on at the time in terms of what was happening legally with Marvel, and a lot of it was amazing that the company came back at all. So I think that then with the rise of the IP being valuable, then you have too many cooks in the kitchen. Yeah. And in a weird way, it's really important for Marvel to embrace transgender characters, because the X-Men and the mutants have always been a metaphor for everybody who doesn't fit in. So let's, stop calling it a metaphor and make it real. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what's changed since Disney bought the company, because, then you have this added thing of Disney sensibility. So, I mean, it's a pretty complicated situation, and anybody that can battle through and that, I mean, obviously it's easier to go to an independent publisher and write a transgender character. But I hope your friend Leah Williams makes it through.
So to piggyback, because you have said a thing a couple of times that I really like about this story, is that one of the main conflicts of the story is like a feminist problem of how you deal with abuse, of how you deal with abuse at the hands of men, and of different approaches of like different levels of animosity towards said abuse or of reconciliation. There's even a slight bit of like transformative justice showing at the end. And I'm curious about this because I think this historically, the moment it releases is like when in 1994, if I'm not wrong, is when the thing that we now call third wave of feminism, that was the first that was really trans-inclusive, starts. And what we had before in the terms of feminism is like a very antagonistic towards transgender people type of feminism that was in the 70s and in the beginning of the 80s. And part of why I think this story is interesting is because it shows like that feminism has a complex relationship with trans people and with trans women, even if we are part of the women that are abused. Like it shows in this story, because Jessie literally is a kid with nowhere to live that is subjected to violence and to gendered violence too. So that's.
I think at the time feminism had a problem with feminism. You know, you had Andrea Dworkin, and you had Germaine Greer, and you had all these uber feminists who basically, I mean, Andrea Dworkin's thing was all sex is rape. Now, when you start saying things like all sex is rape, that is in a weird way, Bloody Mary comes from that point of view. I mean, she comes from the point of view that until, to entirely throw off the male gender completely. So that was her core. Her core was the extreme feminism that is, so anti-male, and yet we still don't have a word for reverse misogyny, do we? I don't know what the word would be, but so she's coming from that place. And there was a lot going on in New York in the 80s when I was at Marvel. I lived in the place I lived in. The lobby was the landlord would let the street people pay some money to hang in the lobby, and there were a lot of prostitutes, and there were what back then was called a transvestite, a transsexual, chicks with dicks. There were all these different terms for what now we call transgender, even though that's really complicated what I just said, and you could rip it apart. But But I used to talk to the girls a lot, and the girls were that line that Jessie says, I'm a girl trapped in a boy's body. That came right from a transgender person who I was friends with in this sort of lobby relationship I had with a lot of the girls. And at the time, sex work was dividing the feminist movement completely, because sex workers felt they had a right to do sex work and that they were feminists for doing so. And the feminists thought they were being exploited even though they didn't know it. So you have a lot of this kind of tension that exists even, now when a child knows they're trans, and the parents and the community puts this damper on them. That is the community saying, we know better than you yourself know who you are. And that was happening with sex workers in New York City. The feminists were telling them, you're being exploited. You don't even know you're being exploited. And the sex workers were like, screw you, this is who I am. So that it was a very complicated time for feminism, for sex workers, and it wasn't that long ago. In the 80s, it wasn't that long ago before it was illegal for a man to put women's clothes on. Yeah. You could be busted for that. And I spent a lot of time at my boyfriend Armand and I had a lot of gay friends, and we spent a lot of time at the Pyramid Club. The Pyramid Club was a cross-dressing drag queen club, and we had this wonderful friend, John Kelly, who created this persona called Dagmar Onassis. And it was a time of a huge acceptance for whoever you wanted to be. And I think that life has become more conservative. So these things come in waves, and if you live long enough, like things shut down, things open up, things shut down. And so what might be going on at Marvel, as we know, is the diversity. There was a backlash against diversity, and now there has to be a backlash against the backlash. Yeah. I think.
I just want.
No, go, Travis, go.
I just wanted to say one thing that I really liked with that story in particular, and the guest stars, so to speak, Wolverine and Vengeance and so on, is that they have no connection to the story. There's none of the men in that story really have anything to do with what's going on with Marriott, what's going on with Typhoid, but they're all debating it constantly and what they should do about it, what should be done about it. And that really felt like, I know you were kind of forced, you had to throw some guest stars in there, but it really does feel thematically like we've all been in that situation. We've all been in that room where you have life going on and there's three guys over here who are debating what should actually happen.
Debating your existence. I mean, and it's sort of like, I love all those characters. Obviously, I adore Daredevil. I adore Wolverine, and Ghost Rider. I didn't even know that well, and we created Raven. I think her name was. And it was like a bunch of guys in a locker room fighting over like this hot girl, Typhoid, without them even knowing that Typhoid was, Typhoid is in a lot of ways, she's trans herself because she's got a man living inside her. Yeah. She's got Bloody Mary living inside her. She's got a persona that hates all men. She's got a persona that loves all men and seems to be blind to women. It's like she's a complicated, fragmented, lost, and the way she was created was, reading stories of women who had been abused, and how in order to deal with abuse, you say it happened to that person over there, and that's the original split. And You know, and then with Mary, it became further, here's another persona that's going to go get all the men, every man, all men. So I think that leading to the moment when Jessie Drake reveals who she is, that was what we were going for in her nasty reaction to Jessie. So anyway, we've already talked about that, but I can see, because of your wonderful essay, and you've both written wonderful essays, probably you too, that that moment should have had more layers of nuance. But in some ways, when you're writing a superhero narrative, you have to have, superhero narratives are escalation narratives. They have to escalate to fights. And you can see that I said, okay, it's a superhero narrative. It has to escalate to fight, but let's put all the fighting out in the backyard. The real drama is going on over here. But then we'll just keep cutting to all this pointless fighting outside, you know, so that it can be a superhero narrative. And, you know, I don't, so anyway, another question?
I think, okay, so I think some of the things that happen in those two issues, like what you say just with Marianne, like the trauma that happens with her trauma because of abuse, that makes possible to represent within a thing that happens to people in real life, to represent like ideologies or like relationship to ideologies, also happens in that moment. Now that we're back at that moment in which Jessie gets misgendered at the entrance of the shelter, to bring up the real issue of like trans homelessness, of the fact that Jessie needs a house, because she doesn't have one. And DANI is gonna pick up here very well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, and I think that, you know, it's an interesting didactic opportunity, because while the scene is traumatic, and I've been thinking a lot lately about like the violence of the issues itself, where you do have, like, for some reason, all of the fighting, all that goes on in the background with the men that are like, you know, having this paternalist pissing contest in the background. Not a single bit of that fight feels nearly as violent to me as the scene in the shelter. And I think part of it is because, like, I have lived that moment so many days of my life, and I know that violence is like, it's so raw, it's so real, and it's so unexpectedly violent. And I think that, you know, it's interesting because I've been working on another essay about Jessie, specifically looking about how does this story tell a real, like, lesson about trans and gender variant youth with homelessness as a frame for that experience. And looking at these statistics, like, they only continue to skyrocket. Like 2015's National Transgender Survey, I think, ranked or identified that like at least 40% of all trans people experience homelessness at least once in their life. Interestingly, that same study found that of all trans and gender variant people who did seek out homeless or like housing shelters, 70% of them were assaulted by staff or other members or other people who were, you know, seeking out shelter. And that's what happens. Like, Jessie's story is immensely complex, and it's also all real. And it presents an opportunity to look at, like, yeah, like I mean, even last summer, we were dealing with this exact kind of situation being codified in an explicit legal ruling that the Trump administration tried to put out through the HUD, where, you know, I think the text of it is literally like checking for the presence of facial hair, of an Adam's apple, and like, it is all about gendered policing. And I think gendered policing really tends to not dawn on us a lot, but these two issues tell a really interesting account of like how complex it is. Like, gendered policing is Jessie's entire experience. Like, she is entirely subjected to other people's interpretation of her own identity, her gender. You know, the staff member, you know, Bloody Mary, Typhoid Mary, like everyone is reacting to Jessie's experience. And I think it's really interesting that Bloody Mary embodies that kind of like what's now referred to kind of like as a TERF, like a trans exclusionary radical feminist, where like Bloody Mary like really embodies something historically true about trans women specifically, which is, despite the fact that they literally led the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement, they are historically erased from those narratives. They are historically erased from any queer trans theory, you know, well, not trans theory, any queer theory that attempts to tell that story of the kind of radical organizing of the 60s and 70s. Like they are erased, and it really comes out of this kind of like counterinsurgency within, you know, the second wave feminist movement that tries to conceive of trans people as, you know, men appropriating femininity, men who are using the trappings of femininity to invade trans spaces. And I think for a really good articulation of that history, I would recommend like Susan Stryker's Transgender History, because she goes into tracing that like legacy through like the late 20s all the way up to present day of how constantly you are seeing the need for, you know, cisgender white women within the feminist space to have to kind of reframe their own goals in order to then subject another person to the same gendered policing that they're reacting to. Like it's interesting because I start to think about cycles of trauma within the trans community and how much of it has come from just the sheer fact alone that we are continually being erased and subjected to the same forms of mistreatment that other people are fighting against. Like Mary is on this crusade against gendered violence and is in her own way enacting that onto Jessie. And it's...
Yeah. And I mean, I would say that, you know, we were talking, I mean, semantics, the semantics of it are very interesting, because I don't think that, I don't know how to put this, binary semantics. The language isn't there yet to even discuss some of this. I mean, we've all grown up in gendered binary semantics. And so that's why I think the terms keep shifting. And it's why it's even hard to articulate these things, because I don't have a part of my brain that can access the language I need to explain what I was thinking and feeling as a female who was being shoved into judgmental categories of you're a good girl, you're a wife, you're a slut, you're a this, you're a that. And that barrage of terms as you're growing up as a female, you know, that kind of a feeling can be adapted to thinking about trans people. And I think that one of the ways I try to understand the world is to constantly return to empathy. And that is one of the reasons Jessie Drake is an empath, and to the point where she's trying to mimic everyone around them in order to understand them, because she's a, you know, a tender empathic person. I mean, so, you know, to have empathy and then also to look at what is universal in anything that's going on. And there is a problem with conformity. It's funny, I'm writing an essay now about moss, of all things, because I've always really hated the American lawn and how the American lawn is like this weird visual thing that says everyone has to look the same and be the same, and your grass should be, you get fined if your grass gets. So I was writing about how much I like moss and how it can take over a lawn. And then I realized you're writing about how much you hate conformity. you know, and it's so much out there. I mean, the American lawn is oppressing, is suburbia, so that when you walk out of your house in the morning and you are a little, you're a little girl, and you weren't born a little girl, but you know you're a little girl, and you walk out of your house and there's no touchstones, and there's no semantics for you to feel okay about that. And so, you know, I don't really know what I'm talking about anymore, but I have a feeling that this stuff it's so woven into our culture, you know, that it's a sea change. And I think just as, you know, many years ago, women couldn't vote, blacks couldn't vote, blacks were slaves. You know, you look at the history of the oppression of humans. If we could go ahead, you know, 10, 20 years ahead, I am hoping that there's going to be a lot more understanding, because there's a lot of kids right now that are on the forefront of, they're pioneers in trans, the little kids really that are speaking up and finding communities, and they're pioneers. And by the time they're adults, hopefully, some things will have changed. I mean, I hope.
Well, I have to say too, you know, reading these stories when they came out in '94, about a year before that, my family and I were homeless, and we had just moved to a state. It was a bad situation, but we were kind of stuck. And the state would facilitate families to stay at campgrounds. And they're basically paying for your camping spot, and you've just got to handle everything else. So we were doing that. And it was a constant struggle for me to go take a shower, because they had the men's showers, they had the women's showers. I was like 12, 13. And there was always somebody, and they're individual showers. There's nobody in there with you. But it was every time you go to either side, some adult would come over and give me another lecture. And I go to the other side, maybe some other adult. And I didn't have language for how that made me feel or what was going on with that. And I remember reading this story when it came out, and when the scene kind of blows up at the shelter, I knew that things were going to happen, and I was glad that there's reconciliation at the end. But that scene kind of became, in a way, my language internally for, oh yeah, this was last year. That's what this is. And so I think part of, like you were saying, because we don't have the language for these things, that we have to kind of find other ways to articulate them or other ways to understand them. And so while you were saying that, I realized, like, yeah, definitely that scene was my way or my language to understand what had happened to me the year prior.
I mean, it's interesting also, I mean, as somebody who works with trans youth a lot, like weekly basis, it's specifically like when I work with folks who are like 17 to 19, like that age range, I see it the most with, where even as somebody who, like, as a sensitivity reader, as a consultant, I take pride in the fact that I feel like I always understand some of the most emergent language and conceptualizations of gender. And I'm always kind of blown away by specifically like what I guess Gen Zers have access to, that even just like the millennials didn't. And then when it comes to millennial trans people, the level of language that we had access to that Gen X didn't. And like it's interesting because I read a lot of Susan Stryker, but I was just reading her Frankenstein essay where she looks at like the move from transvestite to transsexual to transgender to now we're just like trans with an asterisk. And it's an interesting trace where like you can see the language itself maps to a continual and foundationally growing body politic. You know, transvestite opens the door to transgressing gender expression. And then, when modern surgical technology emerges, you're able to transgress sex. You're able to transgress, the body as a finite set of systems. And so you have transsexual. And then, as we emerge into like the late 90s, early 2000s, transgender becomes a much more consistent term, because we're recognizing that gender itself is the thing that we are transgressing. Like we can challenge and push against it while divorcing it somewhat from the body. And now we're in this moment where, like, I think so many people who identify with some flavor of gender transgressive identity just use the brand of saying that they're trans or they're gender variant. And it's interesting now where like trans becomes this like locus for broad deconstruction of just gender and systems of identification in terms of like the way that we're tethering bodies and identities together. And I think mapping that to this story, it was really interesting to like, because I've been rereading my essay from last year while I'm working on this new one to look at some of the language that's used. And, in my initial essay, I look at the use of the term like trapped in a boy's body or born in a boy's body. And, like I still hold that like the language itself kind of undermines a level of agency in terms of talking about like the veracity of a person's gender. Like if we're going to say that we're born a boy, we're reinforcing a gender binary that we're also trying to undermine. And I think looking at that language now, I'm really, like I see the historical sensibility of what trans people and trans language looked like in the early 90s and where that shift is. And I'm interested to like look a little bit deeper as time goes on, and maybe if Jessie Drake continues on, is there an opportunity to use the character to reflect on this like growing legacy of language and the way that language and access to it has really defined certain identities? I mean, like we can trace trans history so far back, but we can't trace trans people so far back because, like a common reframe that you hear in queer theory spaces is like, was Marsha P. Johnson trans? And like, no, she never used those words, but when you see her talk about her own experience of gender, it's like exactly what a trans woman would say now. And so like, there are just all these like really interesting ways to look at how language manifests within gender variant spaces. And I think I'm hoping to see this evolve further as a story. I'm hoping that Jessie gets the opportunity to like really expand on her sense of her own identity and like we can see that continue to grow. I haven't.
Well, it's interesting that that I was watching a little documentary about really young trans kids, and even today they use the language of I'm a boy in a girl's body or I'm a girl in a boy's body. I think because one of the things is that if you're born into a typical family, it is gendered. I remember they did this experiment once where they took little baby boys and they put them in pink dresses, and they took little baby girls and put them in blue overalls and then just put them into a room with a bunch of mothers. And the mothers reacted to those babies based on the clothes, completely gendered, like cutie, cuddly things with what they thought was a girl, and dive bombing airplanes and trucks with what they thought was a boy. I mean, this stuff is so ingrained. Gender is so ingrained, and it is still a sort of a way for a young child to at least talk about things that they know are going on in them and how they can talk to their parents about it, you know, in terms of why they either do or don't want to put on a dress and play with dolls or trucks or, and even that, even the accoutrements of a gender are constructs that you would hope at some point would be flung off. But I mean, and I also think that fluidity, each gender is fluid. You know, the idea that I am a cis normative, I mean, even the word normative, like, makes my skin crawl. You know, I don't feel normal or normative in any way. You know, I've never felt like a normal female, you know. And what language do we have for that when you're a little girl and you don't like makeup and you want to play baseball? You're called a tomboy, whatever that is. So I think that there is a way, I think, if you want to open the world up to understanding these things, it's interesting to talk about how even within genders, we're all gender fluid within our genders. And that language, that semantics has to be busted open from its beginnings with stores where the children's stores are split between girl toys and boy toys. I mean, I have a girlfriend who's pregnant. She's having a little boy, so I got her a pink toy. Because she's having a little boy, I got her a pink octopus rather than a blue one, you know? I mean, and it's like, that is like the tiniest rebellion possible, you know? But I think it's like changing the way we look at gender flat out in order for everyone to start having empathy. And, you know, and that is why we love, even when we are, you know, angry at Marvel Comics, we do love the history of mutants, which were always meant to embrace anybody who felt like they didn't belong. And at some point, like I think you even said in your essay, at some point, it has to stop being a stand-in for something else, you know, and has to become the thing itself. So,
Danny, I really think they should just hand it over to you.
Yeah.
At this point.
I mean, counsel would advise me not to comment.
Danny's writing a Jessie Drake story that is unofficial, but it's gonna happen in a fan sign.
Excellent.
So I'll make sure that arrives to you. And
oh yeah, I'd love to read anything that you're writing. I'd love to help you with anything you're writing. And, you know, mentor anyone who would like to approach Marvel with stories like that. I did not know that there was a top-down problem over there, because the people I know are very nice at Marvel and really wonderful. And so, you know, I'm kind of in the dark about any of what's happening there now.
I want to pick up a little bit on the last thing you said. I don't remember why I think this, but I'm going to pick up here because this was one of the things that both Danny and I wanted to talk about, was how Jessie talks about her gender. And I feel like there's a thing, so there's something there that is different than the usual narratives, because cis and empath, some kind of empath that changes shape. I don't know how it's said in the comic. It's very like sci-fi. And and so there's a moment where when she says the whole thing about being, you know, trapped in a boy's body and whatever, it's because she's been interrogated about it. It's a response to a question that is questioning her existence. So she's trying to make herself understood. But within those same panels, there's a moment in which she explains that it's not because she's an empath. She's a girl, and she just happened to have discovered through understanding other people's experience, which is what we all do. Like, we understand that we're girls by understanding that other people are girls. If I hadn't known of other trans people, I probably would have found out way later as it happened. So, and that moment for me is very like important in the comic because it separates her powers from her identity.
Yeah.
It says clearly that Jessie's identity is just who she is, not her powers. It's not a
Yeah.
manifestation of, like it has been in the past, like Travis just say, Cloud, or like other moments in Marvel history. It has been like some type of gender fluidity, always attached to the powers,
Yeah.
always attached to the magic, always attached to the sci-fi part of it. And in Jessie is very, very separated. And I think that's one of the high points of the comic. So I just wanted to bring it up here in case any one of you both want to say anything about it.
Yeah.
No, I don't think Steve Lightle, who I worked with on this comic, he sadly passed away. I don't know if you knew that from COVID this year. And he's the co-creator of Jessie. And I do remember that we wanted to give her the power of empathy because we felt like, you know, something, you know, when you're working so fast, and a lot of what I do is I work with my unconscious is throwing things all over the place. And I'm not that rational or analytical about why this, why that, but somehow her as an empath just fit for both me and Steve for this character. But I'm not sure we put a huge amount of thought into it. We just went, she's trans. Okay, let's make her an empath. Yeah, because she would be really empathic because she would understand what it's like to be, you know, discriminated against. And that would be like a, you know, and we just like threw it out. So, you know, again, like what I said at the very beginning, if I had had a chance to think it through a little more, and if I had had your essay sitting on my desk and it could time travel it back 30 years, I probably would have gone to my editor and said, no, you know, can we take 10 pages out of the fight scene so that we could really focus on Jessie? You know?
A soliloquy about gender right in the middle there.
Yeah, and just like, and then followed her down the road and saw what her life is like, and all the mixed male superheroes would have faded in the distance, and you know.
I do think it's interesting though, because I've been thinking a lot about Susan Stryker's just like concept of like trans what is like a big question, and I've been thinking about. I mean, I think a lot about the language that we use historically anyway, because I mean, first off, like even all of our history of this language was given to us by our oppressor. Like,
yeah.
All of the language that we've come to use, like the legacy, like the pedagogy of trans linguistics is like, comes back to this point where like we were heavily pathologized.
Yeah. And
it is all of our language to describe ourselves is not language we ourselves necessarily, you know, planted the seeds of. It was something that we have continued to try to adapt. And it's like a harm reduction model of trying to turn this heavily stigmatizing idea of, you know, when trans people were treated as mentally ill, and trying to reclaim some part of agency through that language. And so thinking about like, what does that process look like for trans youth? Like, I mean, my exploration of gender was very, I think I know a lot of folks whose own conceptions of gender, it starts with having to deconstruct where you're at. And like, you know, Jessie, a kid that young might not have access to the language to say, well, like, no, the most, like, they wouldn't be spouting gender affirming terms about themselves specifically at that time period. They would be trying to work with the tools that they were given. And we know very little about her family. And so it's fair to say that, you know, her being on the street might in some way have been tied to her being trans. And so perhaps her family was not very affirming. And so she's really trying to work against a system that she herself has to unpack and has to remove herself from. And I think that that's a very real process that we all go through in terms of how we look at and articulate our gender over time, where like, you know, my pronouns have changed over the last 4 years. My the way I describe myself has gone from, you know, agender to gender fluid to non-binary to now I just, you know, it's easier to just say what pronouns I use because gender to me is this like radically transcendent part of my identity that like connects to like just a greater state of matter. Like,
but don't you think in the future the word trans will also be dropped? Because
at some point.
I mean, if
Yes.
trans were a short for form of transcendent, it would work, but it isn't. It's a short form of transgressive, and transgressive is got a bad implication to it. It's transgressive is kind of like I'm not normal. I'm not conforming, and I think we have to get away from the idea of like I was saying before, this is normative. Anytime you use the word normal, it is in itself wrong and insulting and just doesn't feel right, because what is normative? What is normal? And so I don't know, maybe a movement to make trans transcendent rather than transgressive, you know? And it's funny that Dwana, you pointed out, you're the only one who noticed the trans character in Ruby Falls. You know,
Yes.
and it's interesting because she doesn't know she's trans until she's has dementia at the end of her life, and just naturally starts wearing male clothes and cuts her hair and speaks as a trans person. But it took dementia for her to find who she really was, who he really was. And, you know, that was designed as a very way too subtle statement because no one picked up on it except you.
I can speak for me personally on that. I feel like the ways that society places pressure on us makes the process of coming up with this very like difficult, and sometimes it's like a harsh life situation that makes you feel that. And it was my case because I had like, I'm super fine now, but I had a brain surgery at some point, and that was the moment when I came out, because I had a very traumatic experience, and I was like, I can't keep for like 10 years more, because I had been known I was trans for 10 years, but I didn't tell anyone. So that was like the torpedo thing. So maybe that's why I connected with the comic, because I was like, oh, I understand this. But going back to Jessie, we have one comment that I feel like it's kind of great, talking about like asking every one of us, I don't know why step Dani, maybe because they already know your answer, if Jessie would have ended up with the Morlocks, because in Dani's comic, apparently Jessie ends up partnered up with Callisto from the Morlocks, and maybe because the Morlocks had this kind of experience of like, you know, they're not like normative looking, and they're also like poor mutants, which is a thing that isn't treated as much. Like they're poor, they live in the underground and all that stuff. And if that would have been like maybe a place where Jessie would have find, I guess, some way of dealing with her homelessness too, because that's an open question of these two issues. So that's the question. I think it's a good idea.
I mean, I think it's a great question, but it's a complicated notion because, you know, the Morlocks being prejudiced against because of their looks. And I think that, you know, it's sort of regressive to not be proud of how you look, no matter how you look. So I would say that, I mean, I would not want her to have to go underground, you know, even if they're very nice and friendly down there.
And I'm just going to throw in Zero Town, because nobody remembers Zero Town anymore, which was a Jack Kirby thing from Captain America, where there's a bunch of hippies living in a commune. And, she can go out and live in a commune in upstate New York. And, there's sunlight and less sewage.
Yeah.
And, so I think the Morlock thing, like I like the Morlocks and the characters, but it is a very regressive, and it's like a warning against in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's not a healthy community in many respects.
I think, and I feel like I anticipate some of what the question's getting at, which is a sort of like fan attempt to sort of reclaim the sort of political position of the Morlocks as like because I think like they've and I've written about this, they present a really interesting critique of what passing means in terms of levels of privilege and access. And I think because of the like immensely queer and trans potential of the mutant metaphor, like using the Morlocks to kind of pick apart an internal power dynamic about the trans community, about who can pass, who can't pass, who has access to the means of passing, who chooses to pass. Like passing is the quickest way to start a fight in a trans space, is just to talk about what passing means in general. And I think the Morlocks present a really interesting concept in terms of like, here is a group that like, because they don't pass or because some of them choose not to, like, Callisto is really interesting as a leader of the Morlocks because in a lot of ways she doesn't pass in certain regards. There are certain parts of her identity that are rendered visible and rendered invisible. And I think specifically like in the last 5 years, I think like queer discourse surrounding the X-Men has really tried to like reclaim a part of the Morlocks as a rejection of the sort of structural hierarchy of the X-Men at times, specifically in eras where like the X-Men were more of a neoliberal institution. They were kind of like the HRC or like a conservative, like gay and lesbian organization, where the Morlocks kind of embodied this like, I think we feel like a more like radical politics coming from them because it reminds us of like punk and squatter culture.
Yeah. And the mutants, after all, have a big mansion in Westchester.
Yeah.
So talk about privilege,
Yeah.
I think for some people it's also because they're explicitly poor, both in the comics and in the animated series. And that's for me. That's like my thing is that they're working class, and the X-Men never are working class. Like almost never.
Like
Cyclops
has never had a straight job,
Yeah.
And I've seen comics that try to frame like Cyclops as I've never been able to look someone in the eye. And
he was a radio broadcaster, wasn't he, for like a hot minute?
Yeah, it's like that's the worst person to kind of pick that's who you're going to pick to represent disenfranchisement. So I think in that way the Morlocks really do work better.
Yeah.
I think that they're definitely the group that would care for. I think that I would feel like Jessie's experience was held better by the Morlocks, maybe because they understand what it is like to persist and be resilient without that level of access and privilege that the X-Men like don't have, which is why like the biggest fan critique of the X-Men regarding Jessie Drake is like, y'all just left her behind. Like Charles sent Wolverine to find her once, he didn't do it, and then Chuck was like, all right, I'll keep building my child army, I guess.
Well, I have a feeling that has a lot to do with Marvel going bankrupt the next year.
Yeah, I mean, metatextually.
The reality is that, if Marvel hadn't gone bankrupt, I probably would have continued to write typhoid stories, and it's also, I always try to bring things back to what is universal and how do we have empathy for even to a certain degree, our oppressors, because everyone leads a double life. It's like an old existential question, and we all lead double lives. I mean, at what point do you break through and lead the life that you really want to lead? And you were saying that it took brain surgery to, right? Isn't that what you were saying? You had a brain surgery. I mean, it's like you don't know, you know, that the idea that we're all cloaked and that we're all have fears and that we're all trying to somehow fit in and at the same time break out. And so anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that. Help.
I think this is a good moment for like Dani, if you want to frame this question, but the question we had about what would you have added to this story today, and that was one question. And I don't know if Dani wants to make some context or additions to that question.
What would I want to add to this story today?
No, yes, both of you.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
actually, I think it's better if you answer because honestly, like I said, I hadn't read the story in, what is it, 30 years? So you know the story better than I do.
I think I'm biased because obviously I'm writing a comic right now about Jessie Drake, but I think if I were to reach back and add anything to this story, I think it would just be, I think the first few times I read it, I wanted to see Mary kind of acknowledge the harm that was done to Jessie in a more overt way. Not because I think in the story that there was really, I mean, I also think Mary is not the type to really spend a lot of time on apologies, just in general. But I think an opportunity for the reader to receive like their kind of like after school special moment at the end, which like, not to be heavy handed, but to like ensure that people understood that like at the end, deeper reflection from Mary about the mistreatment that Jessie was subjected to, deeper reflection about the use of the term like traitor or betrayal in terms of how Mary was framing Jessie's gender in her own language. And I think an opportunity for the reader to see Mary reflecting on that, because Mary is to some extent the POV character, although, you know, obviously there's a lot of complexity to Mary being any POV character in any story, but an opportunity to see her picking apart these things for herself, almost as an opportunity for readers to start doing that dissection a little bit more explicitly for themselves. I think that would be something that, you know, I personally always like to see in stories that overtly include transphobia as an opportunity to sort of like look at, you know, first off, what does it look like to unlearn transphobia in a story? How does it go from, you know, transphobic moments of violence to something that looks restorative for an individual, for somebody to understand their wrongs? Because like I think also like it's easy for me to critique something as transphobic. It's harder for me to make a transphobe understand how and why something was transphobic and give them ways to reconcile with something internal to themselves. And like, you know, there are entire lines of work of people who just work on building, you know, empathy maps for cis people who need to like understand like where does the root of that transphobia come from.
Well, I think also because I'm not positive, I don't think Bloody Mary was being transphobic so much as she was man-hating. And so she thought she was helping a girl. And so I'm not positive the moment is transphobic from Bloody Mary's point of view, that if I could go back and redo that moment, I have a feeling that it would have been great if Bloody Mary had had a moment when she realized her own flaw in seeing the universe as split into men bad, women good. and realized in that moment, she would have realized the flaw to her own, and because she is born out of a little girl being raped by a man. And so she would have had to be able to see her own rage machine, because she is basically a rage machine. She would have had to gone back in the moment and went, oh, and probably what I should have done in that story was had one of the other alters take control, because she probably would have been shattered by what she just did. And another alter would have come to the fore, probably Mary herself, not Typhoid, not Bloody, not Walker, but Mary herself, who is all love. And she would have been able to embrace Jessie. So I think it would have been, I mean, I don't know exactly, but if I could go back at that moment, I think I would have done something like that.
I feel like I want to add my own solution to this.
Yeah, please. Go for it.
It's a little gruesome. So I kind of would have, piggybacking from a comment that we just got about like Bloody Mary understanding and kind of the grownness in her point of not understanding Jessie as a little girl, of understanding her as a little boy, and she's not. I maybe would have put, and I know this is not gonna be like super popular, but it's a reality too, that Jessie was also a survivor of sexual assault as a child, which is not an unusual experience for trans people. It's mine. It's a lot of other people. And that would be like a connection point between the two. Like Bloody Mary realizing this person she has understood as a sexual assaulter or potential or whatever has survived the same type of violence as her. Because that makes for a real understandable in story chains. It's a little bit gruesome and it's putting more trauma into the story, but that probably would have made sense. I don't know if other way would have made sense, because I don't feel like that's something that Bloody Mary will come to understand by herself without some clear external motivation, and that would be a probability. But I just want characters to suffer, I guess.
Well, and that reminds me of from your Kid Eternity run, and the same sort of recognition of trauma, and that I think for me, when I read that as a kid, Bloody Mary can be very almost heroic in a way, because she is punishing bad people, and it is a real rage and a real frustration. But when she gets mad at Jessie, to me, it didn't necessarily read as she's actually mad at her in any way. It was she's yelling at all men, and that's a child that's an excuse to do that.
No, that's right. Those are her blinders. Those are her blinkered blinders. You know, that's how she sees the world.
And I can see the other reading of it. I can see, especially if you're very close to it, the other reading to it, which I think it's that thing of, do we, just because a character is speaking, are they our POV, are they right or are they wrong? Which is why I'm glad that scene is in the dead middle of the story and not, right at the beginning or right at the end.
Well, I think that Typhoid, Bloody, Walker, Mary is the essence of an unreliable narrator. You know, I mean, nothing is reliable about her point of view. But ultimately, all you have is what's on the page in the end. And so it really doesn't matter what my intentions were or how I feel about it. It's the story itself and how people like you all react to it is in the end more valid and more powerful. And so therefore, I think any interpretation is valid of the story.
I think this is a good moment to talk about the ending of the story, because we have like kind of talk about a lot of the moments, but the ending when they're like walking into the sunshine and everything gets solved somehow. And I feel like a big part, I like this ending a lot, and I like it especially because I mean, I have my critiques, and I think Danny does them better than me, which are like around the issues about like Jessie like kind of fixing Mary's view of the world, kind of like making her understand herself, kind of making a lot of emotional work for Mary, and Mary gains all from that relationship, and Jessie gains, I guess, not being homeless, I suppose, but not like, it's not a mutually beneficial experience, because it's like Mary asking these questions about her gender, and you know, it's not like, it's not painted as mutually beneficial. But I think it also has another part that is great, that is about like these things that we have been talking in all this conversation about, like feminism in that era, and how it struggled to recognize trans people. I think a great thing at the end is like Mary is not leaving feminism behind at all. In fact, she gets the man that abused her. She gets him arrested, and there's like movements there that are made for like her liberation. She's not leaving feminism behind, but she's going wherever she goes with Jessie, which is like metaphorically pretty cool, because it makes for a view of like, even if Jessie complicated her view of feminism, feminism doesn't like disappear because trans people exist. Like we need it to, just not some types of feminism that are pretty toxic towards us. So that's it. If you want to add anything, Danny.
I think it's interesting because she quite literally is leaving a one wave of feminism and moving through into another. And I think, you know, the trying to think of like the best way to phrase this, like Mary, I mean, one of the most like real experiences of a lot of like trans women's lives is having to like consistently do emotional labor to inform cis women on how best to respect them. And I mean, it's an inherent power dynamic in that relationship, because there's a cis woman and a trans woman, because the adult is the cis woman and the child is the trans woman. So there is a leveraging of a power structure there that really defines their relationship. And the idea that, you know, the idea that a trans youth therefore has to spend this like great emotional labor to basically educate Typhoid Mary on what it means to embrace an idea of feminism that doesn't see trans inclusion as antithetical for advocating for women, and say like, yeah, Typhoid Mary, you can still do all of what you're doing. You just have to see that I fit into it. Like, and I think that, you know, having reread this story a few times since last year, that is the moment that I think reframes a lot of what's going on before, where, you know, Jessie's really saying like, your point isn't wrong. You're just not including me on the right side of the equation. Yeah. You need to put me here. And now we've built, you know, she's literally helping Mary to build a solidarity with trans people. And I think the two of them like literally walking off into the sunset is an opportunity to say like, yeah, like throughout the story, we have framed Typhoid Mary, Mary Walker, Bloody Mary, like we've framed this character as an embodiment of different views of feminism and different movements and sects within feminism. And now here is a new iteration of feminism that is created as an intersection, as a built solidarity. And it's like, it has really interesting potential, because like I would love to see somebody explore like what Mary and Jessie do from that point on, because there is an opportunity for that relationship to build so much of a conversation about their power dynamics, about the way that, you know, Mary's concept of feminism needs to be reframed and broadened and, you know, expanded on. And I think that that is, yeah, I'm really appreciative of that moment because of the way it frames a much broader social question about trans inclusion, especially right now, while we're seeing a consistency from these, you know, women first organizations to refute the veracity of trans women and the authentic nature of trans women's gender. And it hits me very differently, like looking at that story now, specifically because like this past year has been like a really wild ride for dealing with TERFs in the media.
Yeah, I mean, I think the brutality of, I mean, what you just said was really beautiful. And I think that the brutality of women not accepting trans women is really just shocking to me. I don't know. We got a lot of work to do.
Well, and I'm thinking too, like we have a little bit more of Marvel Comics Presents after this storyline, but not too much. And then, like you said, Marvel goes bankrupt, and a lot of storylines just stop dead or stop cold.
Yeah.
But this is also the end, really, of Typhoid as metaphor, Typhoid as satire, Typhoid as politics.
Yeah.
And gender politics. Every other Typhoid story, barring a short story that you did years later that I can think of, Typhoid is devoid of all of that. She is just hot, crazy chick.
Yeah.
And that's the role. And a mutant.
She's literally like the manic pixie dream girl of Marvel for a certain amount of time.
I mean, I must admit, I don't know any of these stories because it's, you know, I
wouldn't worry about it.
Well,
There's not much to know.
I'm actually somebody who I like when you create a character and you throw it into the sandbox. Yeah. I'm really happy for everyone to play with the toy. You know, it's like, do whatever you want, because I think all interpretations are valid and characters should stretch like rubber bands, but I think it's pretty telling that everyone fixates on Typhoid and rather than the other three.
Yeah.
And it's the other three have always been a bit more interesting to me, you know, so but
Mary is great.
Yeah.
I mean, the Daredevil run, I love Mary in that. And yeah, talking to other people, it's often a case of that. I notice people forget that Mary was even part of that equation or her dynamic with Matt, which is, you know, hilarious and touching. But yeah, it's all of that's kind of gone away.
Yeah, it's funny. I think it was, Molly Crabapple and I did a Bloody Mary story and it's funny because Molly's partner is Fred Harper, who had done the second half of the Marvel Comics Presents with. So, you know, and Molly Crabapple is a really, I don't know if you know her work, but she's a really powerful feminist, and she's a really powerful sex worker rights. And so it was a lot of fun to do that story with her. But yeah, other than that, I don't know the other Typhoid stories. But somebody told me that she's going to be in something, right? Is it Lee Williams going to do something with her, or some? No,
I don't think so.
Not that I know.
Oh, I think she's coming back in Daredevil, maybe.
The current Chip Zdarsky run is has brought her back, but I've only read a few issues, and I don't know how deep they get into like her plurality. I don't understand the character. I don't understand the context of the character being used in the current run enough to say like good, bad. But from what I'm seeing, it doesn't really necessarily feel like texturally similar to the pre-collapse era, I guess, for lack of a better term.
I mean, Chip is great. He's really talented and he's really hilarious. And I think that one of the great things about Chip Zdarsky is that he really brings humor back into comic books. And I think it's a wonderful thing that he does that.
So
if I can just, and this is open to all of you, because I would love to know specifically the being a mutant thing with Mary, with typhoid. To me, it really detracts from the potency of trauma and healing or just handling of trauma. How do you feel about? I don't know who made her a mutant. I think it was Dan Slott, but and it may have been an editorial decision that a writer we know of didn't even make the call. Somebody was assigned, so I don't want to speculate on that, but how do you feel about that she is now canonically, it's just a mutant power?
I mean, I'd have to read the story if it was done well. I mean, the 80s, when I was writing Marvel Comics, there was really no editorial interference. There was you could do whatever you wanted. And there was nothing like what's going on now where all the cooks are in the kitchen. So I don't really know where that came from. I never thought of her as a mutant. But I would have to read the story, and if it was done well, I mean, I think someone did a story where they did a flashback where she was kicked out of a window or something and made her a prostitute, maybe. I mean, I think stuff has been done to her that there's a logic to it, but I'd have to read the story, So I don't know. But I think it gets back to the line in your essay where you say that it has to stop being mutants, mutants as a metaphor. We love mutants as a metaphor, but it's time to drop the metaphor and address the actual what the thing is a metaphor for. So, I mean, I think that is really a brilliant notion.
I mean, I think for Typhoid Mary being a mutant, because I'm not familiar with the specific run that makes that move, but I'm maybe this is a question more than a statement. Does it frame Mary's plurality as being endemic to the mutation, or is it kind of?
I think yes, like Leah.
Then I mean, like,
kind of sucks.
I think
Then it avoids the root of her problem, which was childhood abuse, and that's why she split, and that's why young girls and boys probably, when there's trauma, the only way you can survive is to pretend it happened to somebody else. And I'm no shrink, and I haven't read the current literature on this stuff, but I have a feeling there is no such thing as a multiple personality. I don't know if there is, Back in the 90s, we used to talk about how there probably was, but I don't know.
There is. And I saw somebody say in the comment that Mary is canonically going through therapy in this run. And I mean, like,
That's nice.
Yeah. I mean, I think, though, I saw also someone mention that her personalities are referred to as being united. And I think, I mean, I know just in the work that I do, I know a few folks with plural identity. And I think that, I mean, the idea of tying any marginalized group to being representative through a metaphor like mutation, like, I'm going to have the same problem with Mary's plurality being framed as part of a mutation as I would, like, whenever somebody, when someone is trans because they're a cloud or because they're a Skrull or something like that. Like, I want people to show up, like, representation, for me at least, means the most when someone shows up the way that they would show up in like our world. So, like, great, Rebus is intersex in Doom Patrol for lack of better language, but like they don't, their body is not sex variant in the same way that sex variance takes place in our world. And then there's this like broader question of like, well, we're all sex variant. Where do you put your pillars to define what is intersex? Yeah. And like, I think the more things you tie to the metaphor, the harder it really is to feel good about representation. So like Mary's plurality being a part of the mutation wall, like, you know, there's not much we can do about that, but it's unfortunate that there isn't a way to embrace a character who embodies intersections. It's gotta be somehow like looped in. And I think that like, for me, that's the power of like Jessie's story is like, she's trans and she's a mutant. And we have a canonical statement in a book where she says that my power has nothing to do with my identity. Mm-hmm. I'm just trans and I'm also a mutant. And like, we don't see that a lot. It's also a bummer to hear that like Mary going through therapy, I know a lot of therapists who work with plural clients, and the goal is not to like consolidate or eradicate, but it's like to harmonize and to.
It can be. Yeah. Like it can be both. Like both things are okay, depends on the person and what they need. But it should have been said in the comic. Like if they're going to do that, it should have been explained why this is a better option. Well, it's not the only option. And if it's not explained, then it's bad.
I think that it also has to go back to, you know, why were the X-Men mutants in the first place? I mean, I'm not a comic historian, but I do remember that when Chris Claremont and I and Wheezy Jones were all working on the X-Men and the New Mutants, the idea was we would have a lot of conversations about how would you feel if someone entered a room and they had more power than you did? It was about power and trust. And the idea of a mutant as an outsider was, you know, what if Jean Grey walked in the room and she could read all our thoughts? We would all be very uncomfortable, and there would be a certain sector of society that would want to get rid of her. And so that was the whole Xavier protecting them and Magneto wanting to like kill humans and the superior race stuff. And I think all the themes that around mutancy in the 80s were very different from now, in that it was more a matter of how would the world react to people with too much power. So when did mutants become a metaphor for people with less power? You know, so that is a little bit strange to me because of what a mutant originally supposed to be, was feared and hunted and hounded because we're afraid of them because they have power, and can we trust them? And, you know, of course, what was they called? The evil mutants, the Society of Evil Mutants, or something.
The Brotherhood of Evil Mutants.
Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And so you know, it's the idea that someone who is, it doesn't quite work for everyone who is marginalized, because it tries to embrace the powerless.
Yeah, and, I mean, I think.
Yeah, even though people read the comics as, I feel hunted and hounded and I'm not normal and I don't fit in, therefore I relate to being a mutant. But that metaphor falls apart when it's the less powered. Yeah.
I do think it's interesting. I mean, I largely agree, but I always challenge myself to like, I mean, I am somebody who takes the mutant metaphor probably too seriously a lot of the time. But I also think that there's really interesting stuff in the moments where the metaphor breaks down, where like, like there's something to be said about like the power that marginalized communities hold and how much of like a threat that is. So like, you know, in terms of like the queer metaphor, like trans people pose they are like an embodied threat to the binary gendered model that society is organized by. And we like kind of through our very existence say like, this is a lie. What you're being told is untrue. And it leads to a path of critical questioning that could really unravel a lot of conservative values that, the United States is built upon. And I think I agree, but I do think that there's an interesting opportunity to look at like when marginalized groups become a threat, which is historically, it's always been true. And like, that's why organizations like COINTELPRO show up. Where like,
Yeah.
hey, Black Panthers are starting to like really organize in a way that like is throwing some pretty harsh light on like the fact that like our welfare systems are entirely inadequate or like not equipped to solve the very forms of marginalization that we create. We have to now find ways to undermine these threats. And I think that's like a really that's a specific opportunity to look at like the power that exists within, marginalized communities that is a threat.
If you also look at history, did the threat turn out? I mean, women daring to say that they had the right to vote.
Yeah.
I mean, did that turn out to be such a terrible threat?
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I mean, the word threat is also can be used against you.
Yeah.
If you say that we are a threat, that language is combative and it can be turned against you. So, I mean, but again, then we get back to semantics and how binary language, and it leads to binary thinking, and binary thinking is not adequate anymore for the world we live in. And so we need like we need to like invoke a semantics professor right now who can start reorganizing language for us, But I think, it is dicey to start calling yourself a threat. I think that there's got to be a better way to frame that.
Well, I think too, like I hear a lot from X-Men fans now, more than I feel I used to, that these aren't superhero comics when you have certain criticisms. And so like when Rain Sinclair, when Wolfsbane was killed, and that was framed as sort of a mix of police assaults or white assaults on Black youth and trans people being attacked by these frat boys, meet her in a park, freak out that she's a mutant, and they kill her. And I would almost let that, very vague metaphor stand if the story had been better, A, but also B, if as a superhero, she just kicked all their asses. What really helped me out, and I realized like I'm really a superhero fan apparently, because what really helped me out was I'd been reading about Wolfsbane as a superhero for 30 years, and she can't fight like 5 drunk frat boys.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is like, it requires undermining. I mean, Rosenberg explicitly stating that is meant to be a transpanic allegory, shows like, because you read that scene, you're like, Rain is on X-Force for a certain amount of time. There's no way, like you have to mutilate parts of the character's history in order to make this statement about trans people's experiences without having trans people in the stories, or like, again, like by trying to use this metaphor, you're harming the communities that you're trying to empower. You're doing a disservice to the characters that are in this story. And like,
if you talk about the origin of superheroes were originally created by marginalized people. They were, there's a reason why Jack Kirby and Simon and Schuster and a lot of the original Jewish creators. And then over the years, and I think one of the things that did bankrupt Marvel Comics was because the idea that a superhero was the exclusive territory of a male power fantasy. And comics became very grotesque in terms of that male power fantasy component. And really there was something kind of horrible about taking the superhero as a empowerment for a marginalized person, the immigrants, the Jewish immigrants, and turning it into your white male power fantasy thing. So the fluidity of the ups and downs of what is a superpower, I mean, again, that needs that needs to be redefined. I don't know this Rain story, but it sounds, you know, I'm sad that someone killed Rain. I mean, that's, and honestly, if I was the editor, she would have beat the shit out of them. But no, it's, you know,
Yeah,
I don't
that's what. She's back. At least she's back with all the mutants. They have been resurrected, so she's back. So she's fine now.
And she did get resurrected, but yeah, it was like, yeah, clearly as like a superhero, like I really felt like, wow, I'm a superhero fan, because I was, and Rain, I think, had meant so much to a lot of people. I know for me growing up, and there was a lot of myself that I could kind of project into Rain, or the other way around. And so that one really hit. I would have let it stand as a, I would be happy with Rain as a, you know, metaphor for trans people or whatever. Like maybe I'm desperate for representation, but I was like, I will let that story stand until she dies. And the minute that she dies and she can't fight, suddenly I was like, I just checked out, kind of.
Well, also I think that, you know, if we're gonna do, if you have a society that has something wrong with it, and you have people that are going to try and change, you know, you can look at the Black movement of, you know, the followers of Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King. I mean, you know, there is a place for anger. There's a place for fury if you're trying to change things, and there's a place for love. And, you know, the sort of split between the Malcolm X and the Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, or with the feminists, you know, the split between, you know, over sex work and the Andrea Dworkins versus the sort of Gloria Steinems. You know, you have different warriors who are fighting basically social justice issues with the tools in the toolbox. And, you know, so I think that you have to be careful of all anger, you know, and I think that the superhero narrative is an escalation narrative. It is a violent narrative. So, you know, but you know, I talk about this sometimes with how when I was writing comics in the 80s, I don't think I did anything. I don't think I brought women into the field in the way the women that came later, like a Kelly Sue DeConnick and a Sana Amanat, and a lot of the women that really said, okay, I'm going to empower female superheroes, and I am going to make comics a safe place for female readership. That happened sort of after. And, you know, I've always been very impressed by that, because we were fighting different battles back then. And so, you know, so it's like now it's you're fighting a battle, you know.
Well, trans people have been fighting the same battle for a long time.
Yeah.
We haven't changed our demands.
But I also think that if you go back in history, there were probably moments in history where trans people were more accepted. And if you go way back in time, when you know, it's like the course of history, there's always been trans people, you know, all the way back to the beginning of time, because it's part of biology. So, you know, we can have access to those times because history isn't written by them. Yeah. History wasn't written by trans people.
Yeah, that's true. And the few bits that were written were burned. So
yeah.
Well, and that goes to what you were saying about having the language for it. Earlier this week, I got way too involved in talking about Alan Napier, the actor who played Batman's butler in the 60s, who was genderqueer and bi, and mostly had relationships with lesbians. And his memoir is fantastic. It's very truncated. It was not completed in his lifetime, so it's very choppy. But him trying at different times and talking about how I have language to say this now that I didn't have then. I hope in the near future I'll have another language. And just thinking myself, doing the mental math of, you know, if he'd lived another 20 years, he would have had that language. That language would have shown up.
Yeah.
And it's always going to be that way. We're always, 20 years from now, we're always going to have a different language, and the politic is going to look different in ways. No,
it's weird because my homage to a queen was Major Domo in Mojo's Major Domo in the Long Shot series. That was kind of my celebration of what it is to be a queen. And I'm sure I could be taken to task every way from Sunday about, that character, but, at least, you try.
Yeah.
And I think that the culture now, people are you self-censor because of the scrutiny, because there wasn't much scrutiny back then. I could say, hey, let's make Major Domo like a celebration of what it is to be a great queen. And it's now I think I would hesitate because I'd be self-censoring and afraid I'd get slammed for it, So I think that's another problem with the spotlight is too large. And people are really justifiably afraid of getting scared, and that's not good. When you have self-censorship because of fear, that's not a good place.
I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just like one. I mean, I think it part of it. Very transparently, I do want cis writers to be afraid of messing up a trans character. Like they should feel that fear. Like, this is my life. This is the life of my kin. And like, I think social media has provided a level of permeability between creator spaces and reader spaces where there is a more immediate sense of access by folks affected by stories to give that criticism to creators than there was prior. Like, I think there's absolutely trans people who read this story and loved it. There are absolutely trans people who read this story and might have had really big concerns about it. But because social media doesn't have that ability to break down those barriers between the reader and the writer, there's less of an immersion. And I think, it's interesting that we see a lot of writers from the X office continually dipping out of the social media spaces because they're afraid of that level of criticism. But like, I work as a sensitivity reader, and the amount of people who like come to me like, I'm just afraid to tell this story, who I help them work through that process with. I think, if someone's afraid to tell a story because they don't want to mess it up, hire a consultant. There are thousands of us out there, and I think the fear comes from people being in their feelings about not wanting to feel. I think they're afraid to fail because I think they're afraid to do a complex system of reflective thinking about themselves in terms of, if I said something that people call transphobic, what do I like? They're not yet ready to go to that place and say like, well, I guess I need to do some deep reflecting about why I thought this was okay to say or write or do. And I think the fear comes from the fact that like no one's willing to like do a lot of reflective work to look at like to fail in the public sphere and to have to own that and to have to like to go through that process. And I saw this. I was talking with another critic friend of mine in response to Teenie Howard's, backpedaling from some of the aspects of Monet's character in X Corp and the idea that like, this is not my story to tell. It shows a real like sensitivity to feedback, or like if you're so afraid of getting critical feedback that you don't write these stories, I think that's tragic, but it's also more tragic that like there are so many resources now that there weren't then in terms of folks who can help tell these stories. And I think that's like a real failing of the industry right now, is that like they don't do anything with that fear and they like live in it. And it reaches a point of stasis where instead of feeling that fear and being like, wow, I'm going to do my research, let me reach out to a consultant, there is this this inaction. And, you know, I'd rather have no story about a trans person than 1,000 harmful stories about a trans person. That's just me, though. But like, I think at some point we have to get creators in the room who are willing to like to live through that failure and to live through that criticism. And, you know, I think
it's easier later in your career, certainly, because early in your career you're just too, you know, understandably nervous. Later in your career,
especially with Marvel,
later in your career you can say, you know, screw everybody, I'm going to do this, and you know, it's. But I think that you know, we have to just keep trying.
Well, you know, for me, I teach, and one of the things I often have writing students do is take the story that they've written, and I'll have them flip the genders, or I'll have them flip ethnicities. And it's not because the flip is all you need. It's not that, you know, a man is just a woman that you're now calling a man. That doesn't work. And the stories are often screwed up because of that. But it makes them start to reevaluate how they're handling when they flip that. And I just make them cut and paste the pronouns, and then read it again to themselves or read it out loud. And you can see the gears turning in their head while they're reading their own words out loud, just with that simple gender flip or an ethnicity change. But I'll also tell students sometimes, and, you know, especially not so much undergrads, but like grad students, I'll tell them, maybe this just isn't your story to tell. There are stories that the more people you have to loop in, or the more. I love sensitivity readers. I think it's an important thing. I love authors who will ask somebody, or artists who will ask somebody. You know, and there are colorists and artists I know who will talk about, you can always tell somebody that's been around more Black people than not based on how they color or how they paint palms on Black people. There are tells in things. But there's also a space where if you're that uncomfortable, or you're that out of it, or you're having to loop in so many other people, it's no longer your story you're telling. You're facilitating someone else's story. Maybe just step aside and let them tell that story.
I know we all have to go now, but it is. I have this story that I did a Daredevil story once about where the villain was a zombie. And, you know, I was really naive and young.
Oh no.
Oh no, we lost her.
Oh no, Anne.
Oh no. This is the first time this happens live. So
well, give it a minute.
yeah, if it doesn't fix in a minute, I'll say maybe 2 hours and 7 minutes.
Okay.
It's a considerable amount of time.
I'm just going to keep you all here until Danny just reads the draft of the essay that you have now.
You know, it's I'm excited for that story, and Val's art is just.
How many people are gonna arrive to this point to like watch until point 2 hour 8 minutes? I feel like I'm just stuck into the people that are here right now and to nobody else.
Yeah.
Only the bravest souls, or the most sadistic. They're masochistic. I mean, to your point though, Travis, I will say, like, there are definitely I've worked with a lot of writers where like we get through like a couple rounds of feedback on manuscripts, and they like sometimes they abandon the project, or they pivot the characters in a different way, and like that's a real thing. Like sometimes you just got to know when you're not the one to tell that story, and I feel like so few writers feel equipped to do that unless someone like comes in and tells them like you don't have to make this character trans if it's this much of an issue for you.
I rejected that job as a sensitivity reader once, and I don't regret it, but it was very well paid, but it was a mess. It was unfixable at that point. And like the novel was already written. You can
love those stories.
You can like, if there's a main point in the plot that is done wrong, I don't need to read like the rest of the story. Like they just sum up the plot, because I was asking questions to know if I was getting the job or not. And I was like, this main point is very problematic. I doubt anyone without the experience can make this right, so I'm just gonna pass. And so anyway, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to be serious about it. I doubt anyone except the people that are watching right now will watch this far, so this is not a fuck up in any way. But
what if Anne just got really tired of us?
We'll find out later.
I doubt it. So people are saying that we shouldn't go. I have to work tomorrow, and it's 11 p.m. here, so don't fuck me up. So, so nah, I'm joking. Sorry to be mean. And
go for it.
So, thank you all for coming and for commenting so many great things. The comments were on fire today. It was like great. It was great, and I don't know how to do this, but I probably say thank you in regards of Anne some way, sometime to you all.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, we thank the presence of Anne here, and thank you all for watching. This was great. Yeah.
24 hours. Let's do a 24-hour stream all about Jessie Drake. People think I don't have anything left to say about her. Buckle the fuck up.
Yeah, I can't do that. My girlfriend is leaving for her hometown tomorrow for like 8 days, so I need to stay a little bit with her before going to sleep. So. So after all this personal information and details that we gave in the last minute and the dog, I think
he is ready. He's very curious now. He would like to know about Jessie Drake.
Okay.
So people, please support the comic of DANI. Please, when it comes out. I hope that's soon.
Yeah. Probably sometime in September.
Cool.
For now, though, you can go buy the print pack on Val's shop. I'll post about it on my Twitter later. And all proceeds are going to Ashley Diamond, a Black trans woman who is fighting against incarceral injustice for trans people. So going to a good cause.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do it in YouTube, but in a comment. I'll probably put the link in the video in Facebook and in a comment in YouTube and etc. When this is like released into an article with a 2 hours and almost 15 minutes video, deep dive into Jessie Drake and everything else you need to know about. So,
well, let's let Duna get some sleep. And some
have a good night, Duna.
Thank you everyone for like leaving a lot of comments now, so I feel bad leaving. So. That's it. We're not gonna be alive anymore.
Okay.